The World Eaters are one of the most brutal and violent of the Emperor's legions. During the Great Crusade, their battle lust and subjugation of entire worlds via slaughter has brought them and their Primarch to heel many a time. Today, we're going to talk about our next Primarch in our beloved Primarch series, Angron, the Red Angel and the Master of the 7th Legion, the World Eaters. Now, this one holds like a pretty special place in my heart, as the World Eaters, or, well, the Khorne Berserkers, for that matter, made up the bulk of my Chaos Army, which was the second army I collected after the Space Wolves when I started 40k back in the 4th edition. Now, the World Eaters are the king of daddy issues, even more so than the other legions, or I guess respective Primarchs, which are the Primarchs of daddy issues. I'll leave that joke out of it. But we'll talk about Angron's brutal early life, the subsequent ripple that has on his life, as well as his fall during the Post-Heresy and what happens to him during and after the war. So join me on a bloody adventure through the bloody annals of Angron's bloody past. Did I just say bloody anal? Okay, moving on. Our story begins on the distant planet of Nuceria, deep within the Ultima Segmentum. Now, as we've talked about, most Primarchs were far-flung to these death worlds with tribal, rural, or feudal populaces. Now, the case with Angron is a little bit different. Nuceria housed a flourishing, technologically advanced civilization that was ruled over by an entire upper caste. Think kind of like a techno Rome, not the whole like techno music part. Now, little is known of Angron's early life, as he's not the most talkative of sort when it comes to chumming up by the fire and sharing little stories, little nothings of his past. And he was discovered by a slaver, surrounded by a dozen or dozens of dead aliens. And those aliens were actually suspected to be Eldar, and I guess the kind of like mythos or the theory behind it is that those Eldar were actually dispatched to the planet knowing what Angron would become to try to dispatch him or destroy him early. And the boy was badly wounded from this, but obviously quite victorious. And this clearly presented itself as a worthwhile gladiator for the slaver, and the boy was sold into slavery. You see, Daemonhood, the primary city-state of Nuceria, was ruled over by a pretty heavy-handed oligarchy. To control the extremely impoverished society, there were daily gladiatorial games in which droves of slaves fought to the death. Like I said, Neo-Rome. Angron was sold to the most powerful ruling clan, Valkyr. He was also granted a name, Angron Valkyr. There, he was brought to the Palace Praxica, which was kind of the seat or like the throne of power for Daemonhood, and he underwent the surgery to get what's called the butcher's nails grafted into his head. And the nails are going to be coming up a lot in this video, but they're grafted deep into the subject's brain, kind of against the cerebral cortex. And the relics from the dark age of technology. We've talked a lot about this before, how there's all these relics that the grander Imperium doesn't know about, but they do a lot of crazy things that again, no one can even replicate. But the nails, they replace the pleasure centers of the user's brain. They're under a certain amount of physical pain and duress, the user that is, but when they get into combat, the nails release endorphins at a rapid amount as the adrenal gland fires, so it kind of works in conjunction with your lust for battle, and the more battle you get into and the more adrenaline that's pumping through your system, the more, I guess you could say, pleasure, but the way that the books kind of describe it is more, it lessens the pain and just reduces them to a state of normalcy, less so than like this like ecstatic, pleasured kind of state that they would be in, almost like a Slaneshi worshiper. It's not like that. They're not sitting there rubbing their nipples as they're chain axing people. It's a little bit different. But it also completely bleaches out emotion and reason from the equation. So you essentially have the pinnacle in merciless killers without having to indoctrinate them or train them. So it's a really kind of amazing brainwashing capability. And as you would expect, a Primarch hooked up to this would be extremely powerful, and Angron quickly rose in fame and prestige as he slaughtered his way to the top of the ladder. And any gladiator that stepped in front of him died or was spared, and if he being Angron, liked the way they fought, he trained them personally and kind of spawned this whole generation of vicious, highly trained gladiators. Angron actually enjoyed the thrill of combat and the roar of the crowd, but this didn't mean he wasn't trying to escape at every turn, because even as much as he enjoyed the kill, he hated the submissive lifestyle of being a slave. I mean, what psychopathic killer who's even more amped up thanks to neurological surgery would want to be enslaved? Or, well, I guess anyone for that matter. To that end, the Lord of the Red Sands, as he's called, decided he needed more than just himself to escape, and started to band together with the gladiators he had trained. During a brand new set of games, Angron made his kind of big move. Nuceria had planned an event wherein all of the gladiators would have this gigantic melee in the arena, involving every gladiator in the city. Now, you can imagine the kind of respect and authority that Angron commanded, not only as a champion, but to some of these gladiators as mentors. So when the time was right, every single gladiator turned on the armed guards for a grand escape. So it wasn't at all what was planned, obviously. And the Daemonhood guards were armed with guns, so this was definitely a kind of like a last samurai sword to a gunfight type scenario, but 2,000 gladiators, including Angron, made it out of the city and into the mountains, where he was first found many years ago. There, he became, Warhammer 40,000 Spartacus. He launched multiple raids and defeated many armies, and pretty much any army that came against him that was trying to subjugate the slave army. And Angron named the army, his slave army, the Eater of Cities. And Angron was able to finally bring his martial skill and leadership as a Primarch to the fore as they won victory after victory. But they were kind of fighting this overarching war of attrition as more and more men kind of died with each and every engagement, resulting in half of the original 2,000 left standing, so, 1,000. But it's worth noting here that they held out for many years before finally meeting this grand confrontation on the mountain of Fedun Moor in the Daemonhood-like ridge. Now, they're surrounded by 5 Nucerian armies. Angron's future was kind of cut out for him, like, metaphorically speaking. There's not a pun here, fucking never mind. And this was around the same time that the Emperor discovered his wayward son, kind of watching for the past couple months, observing his actions before finally meeting his son on the eve before the battle. He offered leadership of the Warhounds, a legion that was made in his image. Now, what I'm about to say is pretty huge. Angron refused the Emperor outright, saying that his place was amongst his people and that he kind of deserted them, it would be a stain upon his honor. Now this is huge. Angron is the first Primarch to refuse the Emperor. Sure, Vulcan and Russ had their little challenges, did not even knowing that it's the Emperor, but every Primarch either knew who the Emperor was immediately or had to be shown through some sort of trial and didn't know who that guy was. He didn't come to him and say, hey, I'm the Emperor of Man. He would come usually in disguise. Angron straight cock blocks Empipu, just sulks him back to his flagship because he approaches him as the Emperor of Man of the Imperium, says, hey, you need to come with me now. You're the master of this legion. He just goes, no, I refuse. The Emperor knew Angron was going to die, and he brings his ship into low orbit and teleports Angron off the planet. Now, most Primarchs kind of have that one moment where they go, oh, yeah, I don't like the Emperor too much. My allegiance is wavering. For Angron, this is different. He immediately holds a grudge, and he considers this a huge stain upon his honor. But the results on Nuceria are brutal. All of his people, demoralized without their leader, obviously, were slaughtered to a man. And Angron was inconsolable, really. Not in the way that he was on his bed, like crying, kicking his feet while tossing and turning and punching his pillow, like Billy's never gonna love me. No. Instead, he'd slaughter anyone that got close to him. The Warhounds, the name of the legion before Angron's arrival, was led by a man named Ibram Grihir, a very well-decorated and respectable general amongst pretty much all the legions. And he went missing, quote-unquote, suddenly, out of the blue, a handful of weeks after Angron's arrival. And it was this way for over quite a few of the high-ranking officers of the Legion, just getting killed left and right by Angron. They disappear, they're dead. Now, and it wasn't until Captain Karn went to confront Angron that he finally saw the character of his Legion. Karn was just beaten to a pulp, near death, but still persisted in winning over his liege lord. This perseverance kind of reminded him of the gladiators of Nuceria, the same kind of perseverance that kept them in the fight and kept them kind of coming back to Angron for more and more punishment, even though they knew that they were going to die at his hands. So this was kind of Angron's acceptance of the Warhounds. He renamed the 7th Legion the World Eaters to honor his fallen comrades. Now, there's usually a sort of acclimation period for every Primarch where they kind of shadow maybe Horus or spend a considerable amount of time with the Emperor, like Vulcan did, for example. Not with Angron. He was just given the keys to the kingdom and told to lock up when he was done, which is kind of wild because this guy is certifiable. Angron's response was to completely reforge his legion in his true image. And he took to retraining everyone in the same kind of methods that he trained his gladiatorial comrades on Nuceria. And this is really it. The only family he ever knew was on Nuceria, and he is sort of stuck in reverie. This is where his mind is almost the entirety of any book that talks about Angron. Even though Angron is always attributed as an emotionless killer, he's actually one of the more tragic Primarchs in the lore. There's no gleaming banners that unfurl over his victorious moments. He just moves from world to world, choking the galaxy in blood. And there's a reason he's called the Red Angel and the Lord of the Red Sands. You know, he spills so much blood and so much barbarity in the meantime. And this brings up another segue I want to go into a bit more. The Butcher's Nails. Now, we talked a little bit about these implants, but the implants that are embedded deep within Angron's cerebral cortex. And we talked about them briefly, but upon returning to the Imperium, we find that the implants are actually degrading Angron's cerebral cortex. Sure, it replaces the impulse to give serotonin on anything other than adrenaline and combat. You know, that is what it is. But it was not meant for the intricacies of a Primarch's brain, and it's slowly killing the Primarch. This, of course, doesn't really matter to Angron. In Master of Mankind, we really get a good light on how Angron knowingly is killing himself by throwing himself into more conflict as it speeds up the process. And additionally, he prescribes his entire legion be fitted with the implants. And this takes years as the apothecaries and tech marines of the legion kind of try to replicate the implants, which at first proves to be extremely fatal. Eventually, though, they evolve to degrade the mind even less, but all new recruits have the implants slapped on regardless. The existing legionnaires had to volunteer for this implant, and most did. Now, this is something I want to kind of drill down on. One of the best books we get on the World Eaters, and their inner workings for that matter, are two pieces. One by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, Butcher's Nails, which is an audiobook, and then Betrayer, which is a continuation of the first Heretic book. It's a kind of like a two-part series. Of all the books in the Horus-Heresy series, they're the two best ones, I think, that really, as a whole, I'm talking about Betrayer and First Heretic. I think they're the two best ones, and the best standalone, and gives you the best background on everything, really. But there's a point where Argel Tal, the first of the Gal Vorbak of the Word Bearers, asks Karn, who is the equerry of the World Eaters now, why he went through with the Butcher's Nails. Now, it's important to know something. If you don't know who Argel Tal is now, he's one of the very first iterations of possessed Chaos Space Marines. We've talked about the Gal Vorbak in some of our previous videos, but this is a demon going, hey man, why would you, or a demon-possessed dude going, why would you let yourself get the Butcher's Nails put in your head when this is a guy who has a demon, like, nestled in his chest, basically? I mean, we're talking about implants that completely change the individual as soon as they're in battle. But the books talk about how Karn is mild-mannered, intelligent, and actually very clever. But as soon as the nails get a hold, he's kind of just lost the bloodlust. They talk about him kind of being lost in a haze, kind of looking around aimlessly as he just slaughters the next foe. But Karn talks about how their father, Angron, was so distant from them and how it was the only thing that they... Or he kind of says, if it's the only thing you know could bring you closer to your gene father, wouldn't you do it, even if it meant pain and death? And the nails for the World Eaters aren't a way to fight better, although that's what they become. They're a way to truly relate to Angron and kind of get closer to him. And Argel Tal kind of has that moment of like, oh, yeah, I guess I did the same thing by having this demon possess me because this is what my father wanted. So it's definitely a really cool moment where you see the motivations behind base legionnaires, why they go to do these atrocities, and why they go to do what they do is because they all doing this for the veneration or the acceptance of their father, who is ultimately corrupt. It's a very cool kind of like self-reflection moment in the books that you don't get too often outside of like brother, forearm clasping. Now, as we kind of get back on point, the legionnaires that failed to make the transition fully with the nails became these kind of unhinged berserkers, forming up what the Legion called the assault companies and named the cadere, which loosely translates from Latin to slaughter. And actually, Karn is a captain of one of these assault companies, so he himself is kind of one of these unhinged berserkers as soon as the nails kind of bite fold on him. By bite fold, I mean get a hold of him. So, with the Butcher's Nails in place, Angron made his way into the Great Crusade to unleash his World Eater. The results were pretty poignant. A whole-scale slaughter of entire systems kind of resulted in almost immediate compliance by the scant remnants of survivors, like the 15 he would leave alive. So great was the World Eater's fury that systems would comply and fall under compliance for fear of having their populace knocked out entirely. Other Imperial officials and detachments began to fear the 7th Legion. Even Bobby G hadn't seen such a no-holds-barred bloodbath since WWE Raw aired on television many millennia ago. And during the cleaning of Regatta, not regatta, that's a cheese, Angron earned his nickname the Red Angel because of his legion's extreme barbarity and lack of prejudice in utterly destroying the foe, creating these literal ramps of corpses over the ramparts, over the fortifications of the enemy. This created quite the rift between him and his brothers. I mean, for one, he didn't like the title of Red Angel because it smacked of too much similarity to Sanguinius, who Angron absolutely abhorred as a mutant. And there was one particular Primarch that Angron has a lasting feud with. I feel like the majority of Primarchs have a lasting feud with this guy, but Russ and Angron are especially not pals. During what is called the Night of the Wolf, the two had a pretty fateful encounter. Angron had gone particularly overboard during what is called the Scouring of Gehenna, a planet brought under Imperial compliance with its entire population slaughtered to a man and a woman and a child, completely killed, devoid of life. And this caused an extreme backlash from the Emperor, who dispatched Russ to bring Angron to Terra to account for his transgressions. The punishment was simple: cease implantation of the Butcher's Nails into the Legion and return to Terra for as much of the nails to be removed from the Legion as possible. Angron complied with his brother's request and followed him to Terra. There, he became a reformed librarian of the Imperium, known far and wide for his retelling of A Tale of Two Cities, which is just a total fucking lie. Sorry. Both Primarchs were backed by their respective legions. Now, this wasn't the first time Russ was dispatched to deal with a wayward Primarch, and certainly not the last, as we'll discuss in Russ's video, but Angron began insulting Russ and the Emperor, calling the latter a slave driver and the former his lapdog. And eventually it resulted in conflict, brother fighting brother, as the two legions engaged and the Primarchs dueled. And this is one of the very first pre-heresy fights between Primarchs that didn't end up in one of them being completely wiped out of Imperial history. There's the two Primarchs that we don't know about that is suspected to have been killed by Russ, sanctioned by Russ. We don't know a whole lot about it. And this is one of the very few times that two Primarchs come to blows outside of course, Russ and Lionel Johnson. And so I feel like Russ is the root of all problems, but not really. I love that guy. But anyway, during the duel, Angron smashes apart Kraken Maw. This is Russ's ice sword. And Russ destroyed Angron's Widowmaker, his first chain axe, his second being Gorechild. Angron eventually kind of gains the upper hand and defeats his brother in combat, but this was all part of Russ's plan. As he tried to bring Angron to reason, through words, as that's totally going to work, the Space Wolves were able to completely surround Angron, needing only the kind of command from Russ to kill the Primarch. So Russ stayed the order, and both parties left the planet with their pride wounded. And Angron actually considered this a win for the World Eaters, as they inflicted more casualties, and neither would concede defeat. It's really a bit of a black stain on both of the Legion's history, because they both kind of say oh yeah, well, I got him in this way, and the other says, oh, I got him in this way. And it just is one of those definite situations where, yeah, you both really lost out in the long run of this one. Despite all of his transgressions, though, Angron was still shockingly efficient at bringing systems to compliance, despite how questionable his approach was. Eventually, it became time for the Emperor to send Horus to try and whittle some form of reason from the twisted Red Giant's mind. This, of course, would prove to not be a stellar idea. Horus immediately picked at the barely healed wound of Angron's spite towards their father. turning him to his side without much convincing at all. Most of the other Primarchs needed, a lot of manipulation or chiding. Angron simply just needed to hear the plan. Thus, Angron became one of the first 4 original traitor legions. Sons of Horus included, of course, and the other were the Word Bearers and the Death Guard, well, plus the World Eaters. And in the early portions of the war, the World Eaters took part in both Istvan III and Istvan V, as we talked about. Remember, the first Istvan battle, Istvan III, was an act that would purge the traitor legions of their loyalist factions. This is the initial play that Horus used to both mask the other traitor legions, the ones that were not there, such as the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, and the such. And this is the initial play that helped lure loyalist legions into his trap at Istvan V. Angron led the second wave of drop pods on the planet after it was completely virus bombed. That was the point was, hey, we'll have all of our loyalist factions drop onto the planet first, fighting off these rebellious cults from Slaanesh, and then virus bomb the entire planet. And it actually didn't kill off as many loyalists as it wanted. It wanted to, or the original plan was to kill off almost all of them, or if not the entirety of them, and then finish them off from orbit. But instead, it only killed about 2/3 of the. It only killed about 1/3 of the actual loyalist factions. They were warned by Tarvitz Saul of the Emperor's children, and they were able to kind of get into shelter. But this result here, that where Angron lands on the planet to go kill off more of his brothers, was not part of the plan. And it led to this prolonged 2-month campaign in which the traitor legions had to hunt down their brothers mercilessly, cleansing all portions of the legion still loyal to the Emperor. And we'll cover Istvan III in its own video like we did for 5. I mean, there is a lot of nuances to cover. I mean, there's so many players in that battle, the Garviel Loken and all the portions of the Sons of Horus that are actually still loyal to the Emperor. So there's a lot going on there, even more so I'd say than Istvan V, because Istvan V was a pretty quick portion of the end of the Fulgrim book. Istvan III almost had its own book entirely. So in Flight of the Eisenstein or whatever is one of the covers it the most, or it's the third book in the series. I can't remember 100%, but it is a huge chunk of one of the books. Now, the biggest portion of the Horus Heresy that Angron took part in was the Shadow War against Ultramar. And this is a huge point in the history of the war, because a full attack on Terra couldn't just be waged heedlessly. They couldn't just go, all right, guys, Istvan went well. Next stop, Terra. Honk, honk. Nope, doesn't go like that. The plan was for Lorgar and his word bearers to attack Calth, C-A-L-T-H. Start this gigantic warp storm called the Ruin Storm and lock down the largest legion and segmentum, the Ultima Segmentum. The Ruin Storm, what it actually did was it prevented interstellar travel between the majority of the Imperium. It kind of cut like a huge swath through it. And most importantly, it shrouded Terra entirely, so that other fleets couldn't see the Emperor's guiding Astronomicon, which is what all the other legions used to move from point to point, nor make contact with the Imperium through astropaths, because they could just, the astropathic choir is what it's called, and actually communicate through the warp and pretty much deliver messages. We see this during what's called Old Night. We talked about that before, right? How the Terra is completely covered by warp storms and is cut off from the rest of the old Imperium, pre-Emperor. So this is kind of like that, a rehash of that very same moment. There was also a bit of a grudge match attached to this. Lorgar desperately wanted to deliver vengeance upon the Ultramarines. Way back in the very beginning, or not very beginning, or in one portion of the Great Crusade, the Emperor and Bobby G swing on over to Lorgar's, favorite world and just glass the entire city, because it looked like as deification to the Emperor. And Lorgar always kind of like looked, he was very insulted, I guess you could say, by Bobby G, because it looked like Bobby G had kind of a smirk going this whole time, like, aha, I'm the chosen son, you are nothing. And that's kind of like the big thing with Lorgar, is he's the word bearer, the bearer of the word of the Emperor. He almost has this zealous attachment to the Emperor prior to, of course, his fall to heresy. So he definitely hates the Ultramarines. And we'll discuss the details of this campaign in earnest when we talk about Lorgar, but a good deal of the fighting was actually done in tandem with the World Eaters, their berserker rampage kind of tearing through the calculated and measured resolve that the Ultramarines have. Rampaging through multiple worlds, the World Eaters were lured to a trap on the world of Armatura. Now, there isn't a ton of like super important lore things to happen in this battle, except for maybe one of the most badass portions of the war, but it's not like, hey, this battle is the ultimate culminating moment of blank, blank, and blank. None of that happens here. Instead, Angron's implants kind of started to fail him during this campaign, and they would sometimes leave the Red Angel in such a desperate berserker rage that he was completely unable to be stopped, unless the remaining librarians of the Legion convened their psychic strength to stabilize their father. And remember, the Council of Nicaea has already happened. These guys cannot use their librarian abilities in the open. They kind of have to do this in secret. The same thing interestingly enough, the same thing kind of happens with Sanguinius. We'll talk about that in detail later, but it's very interesting how much Sanguinius's, or the Blood Angels and the World Eaters, have a very weird kind of parallel. The Blood Angels were supposed to be another Coronate faction or Fallen Legion, but we'll go into that again later. The result, though, was Angron leading a charge against a fucking Titan. As Lorgar tried to help, he was pinned down, and as the Titan went to crush both the Primarchs, Angron stops the Titan's foot from falling on his own head with his own hands. He uses his hands, he raises them above his head, the Titan goes to stop, and he stops the Titan outright. And he goes so far as to reverse the Titan's movement. Holy God. This is just crazy. So he reverses the footfall and saves Lorgar, and eventually, though, Angron is actually covered entirely with a building. Like, it completely falls on him, and it buries him underneath like tons and tons and tons of rubble. The librarians were able to locate and kind of like channel their Primarch's fury to kind of get him and pull him out of his like haze and help him get out of this rubble, but it saved him from being buried to death, I guess you could say, buried alive under a building. I guess it's the only way you can kill a Primarch, is burying him under tons and tons of fucking building. But in this moment, obviously thankless as he hates Psykers, Angron discards his axe, Gorechild. Karn then takes the discarded axe and repairs it, kind of gaining his famous axe that we see all throughout all the remaining editions in which Karn the Betrayer is popular. There's a big kind of superstition with that too. Angron kind of forbids anyone from picking up his discarded weapons, or from any of his legionnaires using their discarded weapons, because it's a gladiator superstition that if you do that, it brings ill luck or bad luck on you, and it can damn the outcome of something. So that's kind of like a big thing there. So he does it in secret and recrafts and repairs the blade without Angron's consent. But after Armatura, Lorgar encourages Angron to essentially seek closure on his home planet of Nuceria. Lorgar obviously has another motive, but Angron agrees. Both Primarchs take their respective Shadow Force and journey to Nuceria, which is in the Ultimate Segmentum, as we've addressed earlier. And the big objective here is to find a way to get the Butcher's Nails to stop killing Angron. Lorgar realizes, hey, these things are degrading at a much more rapid rate, and they will kill you faster than we originally planned. But that's, of course, yeah, he's saying, oh, go get closure, go get those fixed, but Lorgar has another plan in mind. So, as both Primarchs were on the planet, Robert Guilliman of the Ultramarines, as we know, exited the warp at the head of a ragtag fleet of 40-some-odd ships. And he'd been tracking them after Armatura. Guilliman was eager to exact the same vengeance upon Lorgar and Angron that they had exacted upon him. And this wasn't the gleaming, resplendent fleet that we've come to expect of Ultramarines, though. This was the shattered remnants of 1,000 conflicts, hardened veterans of the Battle of Calth and many adjoining worlds. And the result is this brutal void battle that is not the calculated distance attack that it usually is, but rather a dirty, brutal melee. The Ultramarines' flagship, Courage Above All, kind of running abeam the flagships of the Word Bearers and World Eaters, the Fidelitas Lex and Conquer, respectively, delivering crippling salvos. 1,000 small ships sort of tearing wounds into these larger ships as they desperately try to make planetfall on Nuceria. Eventually gaining a foothold, the Ultramarines begin to deploy these among the ruined cities of the planet. They deploy these kind of strongholds, these beachheads, quote unquote. But the World Eaters just to consume each strong point as more and more are created. So it's just this kind of ravening, berserking horde against this very cold, determined, but equally as vindictive legion. After long, the Fidelitas Lex is brought out of orbit, smashing into the planet's ocean as it kind of just limps along and just trudges smoke and everything down into the planet. Lorgar joining the battle on the surface, with Guilliman pursuing him in tow. He has to leave the Fidelitas Lex, and Guilliman does the same out of his flagship. What results is another brutal melee, this time not of Starship and Bolter, but of brother and blood. Lorgar's power maul sweeping huge cleaving strikes at his brother, Guilliman who dodges and attacks in kind with his power fist and power sword. Lorgar is, again, we've talked about this, not known for being an accomplished fighter, but he is still a Primarch and manages to land a devastating blow on Guilliman's head, fracturing his skull, but not before the Ultramarines Primarch destroys the Urizen's sternum with his power fist. Urizen is another title for Lorgar, so we know. I don't know if I've ever addressed that. In that moment, Angron bursted out of the melee, his blades coated in blue ceramite as he hunted his brother Guilliman. Angron leapt into the fray, attacking Bobby G with a flurry of blows that his brother answered in kind. The two kind of fighting a frenzied, furtive pace that outmatched the previous duel tenfold. Bobby G went to deliver his patented Ultra Bobby G punch to the chest as he did to Lorgar previously. Doing this, he fractured one of the skulls of Angron's brethren, knocking it to the ground as Guilliman moved toward the stunned Angron, and he smashed the skull to dust. Taking a step backward, upon reaching the world, Angron kind of discovers that the masters of Nuceria spread lies about the results of the rebellion. So he constructs this bandolier of skulls from his fallen comrades that were left to rot in the desert, and he basically goes to town on everything. And one of these skulls is the one that Guilliman knocks off of his chest, and when he steps on it and smashes it to dust, this immediately enraged Angron set this kind of resonance deep into the warp, one that his remaining librarians felt, as well as the kind of warp-sensitive Lorgar. Lorgar then, in turn, began this dark ritual and the ultimate goal of their arrival on Nuceria. Summoning up the Neverborn from the Aether, he pinned his brother in place. Black and purple clouds enveloped him as he raged wildly against his otherworldly restraints, his vindication stolen from him once more, just as it was from his father, the Emperor. Here, Angron would become the first demon Primarch. The Butcher's Nails, which were once killing him, were now a thing of the past as they empowered his newly possessed form. Now a child of Khorne, the first demon Primarch, Angron, rose in the stead of his once corporeal form. Immediately, Bobby G fled the scene, unable to both comprehend and combat such a foe. The resulting kind of portions of the Horus Heresy are still not fleshed out. The books that are coming out are going to really kind of bring more of that to the fore, but for the most part, this kind of ends what we know about Angron in the Horus Heresy. We do know he takes part in the Siege of Terra, and he is there. The World Eaters are there kind of running up and down the ramparts. We know that Kharn the Betrayer is actually killed during the Siege of Terra. He's kind of flung upon a pile of bodies, but he still gets resurrected and comes back as the chosen champion of not only his legion, but of Khorne himself, because we do know that they do have a new god. The World Eaters completely changed their armor. It's now red and bronze in worship of their god, the Lord of Skulls. Now, the post-heresy life of Angron is rather limited, as it is with most Primarchs that haven't re-entered the lore. And there are two larger, more standout things I want to discuss, though. One is the Dominion of Fire. It starts roughly kind of in the 38th millennium, and it's one of the largest incursions of chaos since the initial heresy, and really since, not counting the certain Black Crusades, of course. This was a 200-year-long war that took 4 chapters, 2 Titan legions, and over 30 Imperial Guard regiments to combat and retake. They knocked out 70 sectors. It is one of the most successful Chaos invasions to date, not discounting, of course, the Wars of Armageddon. The first one, to be exact, is the important one here, and this is there are a lot of details for this fight, and we can do a series about the Wars of Armageddon if you guys want. I'm more than happy to do that, but the first one is the largest. You get this massive invasion at the head of an initial attack of Space Hulks with Khornate Berserkers on them, followed, of course, by a massive invasion from the Eye of Terra itself, led by Angron. Space Wolves, Cadians, and a number of other chapters come to the aid of Armageddon in this kind of just titanic battle between the two forces. This is one of the few engagements where the Grey Knights are deployed en masse. A grand total of 109 Astartes make planetfall to battle the Demon Primarch. Usually they're only sent about in 1 or 2 squads or on little clandestine missions, but the final battle is just this complete bloodbath. Loyalist forces being killed in swaths by the combined might of Angron and his Khornate army. Eventually, Terramar Aurelian, the brother captain of the Third Brotherhood dispatched to the planet, is able to banish Angron after Hyperion, another Grey Knight, manages to shatter the Black Blade, which is the Chaos Sword of Angron. This costs Aurelian his life, but the battle is ultimately won. And of course, an additional cost. Only 13 of the original 109 Grey Knights make it out of the fight alive. So hopefully this video, a long time coming as it was, really helps shed some light on the tragic history of Angron. You have this Primarch that ultimately is bound by a very strong honor system and a sense of brotherhood, but driven mad by these implants that are a result of his circumstances rather than his own design. You're kind of betrayed by his father and then by his brother. He's really a wrathful Primarch, sure, but he's really vindictive in his rage. I think that the Imperium sort of views Angron as this berserker murderer, but I think he's more of a lost soul, kind of rampaging through the futility of the worlds around him. Now that he's a demon Primarch, he's even more so in that situation. But we shall see what the future holds for the Lord of the Red Sands. One of the big rumors out of the 40k rumor mill is that Angron will return with his Khornate army book in late 2018, early 2019. So we'll see if that comes to fruition, as Leman Russ is also rumored to be returning. It'd be kind of this epic reunion, right? To see these two back on the tabletop in their new forms. You know, Leman Russ is supposed to be rumored to be almost Odin-like in his portrayal, more of a wizened old man than a youthful wolf lord. And we know the Demon Primarch to be a, well, Demon Primarch with bat wings and crazy ass faces and stuff. So there's quite a few things on the horizon, I think, for Angron, and I hope to get more fleshing out of him in the Post-Heresy, as well as his Post-Heresy life, as more of 5th edition comes to fruition, as well as more of the Post-Heresy books come out. But thanks so much for watching here today, guys. Go ahead and comment below to let me know what next Primarch you'd like to see, or in subsequent Legion that I go into. We will talk about that, and then hopefully we'll do some more 40k videos here for you guys. I want to definitely crank out a couple more because I really enjoy talking about 40k because I know it a lot better than fantasy, as I've said many times. But as always, guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all that action. Check out my Patreon if you want to kind of weigh in on what the next month's content is going to be, or what Primarch we touch in on the next content. I like to give my Patreons a little bit higher of a vote when it comes to content or Primarchs, their selection. But as always, again, guys, thanks so much for watching. Have a good one, and take care.